a very warm welcome to Cultural Communication Confidence with me, Victoria Reynoldson. And I'm really excited to welcome you to today's episode where we'll be talking about the 5 cultural mistakes that leaders make. Now, I decided to focus in on this topic because I've been doing a number of cultural intelligence trainings, workshops, and sessions recently with a variety of teams, from multinational organizations all the way through to smaller teams and companies that are expanding globally. And I've seen a number of threads come up, a number of conversations happen. And I've also brought in some insights from all of the years that I've been working with cultural intelligence to bring that richness to today's conversation. And I think this really matters. When I have been talking to these teams, this isn't just about something that's nice to do to get to know each other better. This is about really understanding the cultural nuances that are going on within the teams, recognizing that ways of working aren't always smooth. And in fact, there are ways to work smarter and better together. Because here's the reality: when it doesn't work, it really doesn't work. And I have heard some, stories, and I've had conversations with people where they talk about the cultural differences actually causing not only miscommunication and misunderstanding, as I also saw in my first career in marketing, but they also talk about the frustrations, the way that it can create friction within the team, but also, really importantly, can create friction within the project. It can slow it down. And in extreme circumstances, and I have seen this, it can actually stop projects and initiatives altogether. And that's clearly not what we want. We want this to be about accelerating business. And that's really what's possible. When people understand each other culturally, that's when they can work smarter together. That's when innovation flows and ultimately business is delivered. So that's why we're talking about this here today. So in this episode, I'm going to share with you 5 of those cultural mistakes that I see or I hear from others. And I'm going to give you an alternative around a reframe on that. How would you best think about this going forward? And I'm also at the end of today's episode going to give you some reflection questions and some actions to help you take this forward. Okay, so let's get into it. So the first cultural mistake that I hear is that people say to me, we just need to make people aware of each other's cultures. And I think that's a really interesting statement, awareness. And I get it. I understand that it might feel like the simplest solution is for people to read a book or to have cultural awareness training. Maybe you've even had that yourself. And the reality is that this is a wonderful starting point. Cultural awareness is really helpful to recognize some of the generalized ways that people might operate and interact with each other. But it's not the full picture. And if you really want to step into becoming a culturally intelligent professional, a culturally intelligent team, and even an organization, then it requires something more. And what that is really focusing on 4 CQ capabilities. So CQ is short for cultural intelligence. The first CQ capability actually starts with something called CQ drive. And this is really about your curiosity, your interest in other cultures, but also your persistence and confidence when things aren't going according to the plan. I've seen leaders who have been talking to me about the stress they feel, where they've worked in one context, they've worked in one team, and they've been very successful as a leader, but suddenly what's worked for them in the past is no longer working for them now. So, that CQ drive to keep going, to keep trying, even if it doesn't seem to be working initially, is incredibly important. The second CQ capability is CQ knowledge. This is the awareness piece that I was talking about earlier. Now, of course, that is still important. It is great to look at the research to understand some of the generalized views of what, say, for example, the British are like, or the Americans, or the French. But this is not only really meant to be a starting point, because the reality is each organization is different, each team. You are different, and you are not an average. So, this is why it's really important. And the work that I do is that we do a behavioral preference map for individuals and teams so they can actually see it. They can see those differences between themselves, between where they're similar together and where they are different. The next thing is CQ strategy. This is taking all that insight of what you know about each other as individuals and then thinking about what you do with that. Often, as a leader, it's really considering, okay, how do I plan and anticipate what's going to come up? How do you have the awareness to sense what's going on inside the room culturally? And then to reflect on how to keep improving and do differently next time. The final capability is CQ action. And CQ action is where it all comes together. Your drive, your knowledge, and your strategy. CQ action means that you understand how to adapt your words and how you say it, your body language, your voice, and how to really connect to the other person so it works. This is CQ action. So as you can see, it's not just about having knowledge, getting to know each other's cultures. That's a great starting point, but it goes deeper than that. So that is the first mistake. The second mistake I hear, it's all about national culture. Now, there will be some of you listening to this where that is the most relevant application. And for sure, in my work with global leaders and developing global leaders, that idea of exploring differences in national culture is very important. It is important to understand that. But the reality is that our national culture, or what we consider to be our national culture, may only be one aspect of our cultural identity. So, for example, there are many influences on how we show up as individuals. That could be about your gender. It could be about your generation, your background or heritage. It could be about the departments you work in within an organization. I know myself from my marketing days, there were very strong cultural departmental identities. So looking at it just through the lens of national culture is often not enough. And we have to recognize that the way that people show up, their behavioral preferences is driven more than just by one aspect of their cultural identity. So that is the second mistake. We move from just looking at national culture and look at all aspects of cultural identity. The third mistake is that I hear sometimes, occasionally, people say to me, but we have a strong organizational culture and values that guide how we work together. I think this mistake is perhaps the one where I particularly like to draw people's attention to, because thinking that organizational culture is universal, that there isn't these cultural nuances and norms that are influencing what's going on within the meetings and the interactions, I think that is a big mistake. The reality is these cultural nuances play out in all forms of interaction. As I mentioned, meetings, but in Teams messages, in strategic planning, all the way through to day-to-day phone calls or messages to each other. And I see it play out in multiple ways. That's why we have 10 behavioral preferences to describe differences in approaches. And I'll give you a couple of examples here. So one of the ones that I see most commonly in the work that I do with clients is this behavioral preference that's all around communication. So whether you are more direct in your communication style or whether you're more indirect. And that really can lead to quite big clashes. So, for example, if you're more direct in style, that would mean that you would give people feedback and share what you have to say, whether it's positive or negative, in the same style. There is no change to the way you say it. And what you say is what you mean. For people who prefer a more high context, it's sometimes called, or more indirect style, they are often thinking about, particularly with those more challenging messages or negative messages, how do they land that best? How do they soften the impact? And this is where you might need to pay more attention to silences or how people hesitate to say things. Or, in fact, sometimes it ends up being quite wordy and long in the way it's expressed. So, this is one example. Another example that I saw also come up recently, again, was uncertainty avoidance. This is about how people relate to risk and manage risk within an initiative or project. And what happens is you have some people who are very happy with risks, really willing to experiment, willing to have a go and see what happens and learn from that. And these are low uncertainty avoidant. On the other end of the scale, you have people who are very high uncertainty avoidance. And this means that they really understand that risk is a part of business, but they want to carefully manage that. They want to know what the plan B is, maybe even plan C, and they want to know how it's going to be actively managed within the team. So you can see on this one, this behavioral preference, this can lead to a really big cultural clash. So coming back to the mistake, I think it's a big mistake to ignore the cultural nuances that can play out in teams when you're working on projects and initiatives. I think they can lead to, as I said at the beginning of this episode, quite big frustrations and sometimes can actually really stop the projects altogether. So from thinking about just organizational culture, it is really important to think about other aspects of cultural nuance that's playing out within the team. So the fourth mistake I want to talk about is that you have to get it right culturally. Now, this is quite an interesting one that I hear from middle managers sometimes, but also from senior leaders. These are the people who are used to feeling very much in control and knowing the right way to manage other people, to motivate them to get their best results. But as I was having a conversation with a leader a few months ago, one of the things that is challenging sometimes is that people are not responding to you and to your style in the same way they used to in a different cultural context. So what's worked for you in the past, being a manager or a leader, perhaps doesn't work for you as effectively in this new cultural context. And that can feel deeply frustrating. You've got a style that works for you, and perhaps it's not working anymore. This can lead to genuine cultural stress. It can feel a bit out of control, and it can lead to self-doubt and worries about your effectiveness as a leader as well. The reality is that when it comes to working in diverse cultural situations, when you're working with very diverse teams, that sometimes you will make mistakes. Cultural mistakes will happen, and that's a normal part of the process. This is part of your CQ drive that we talked about when we were talking about this capabilities, the very first capability. And so it is about knowing that when you make a mistake, it's about the reflection and learning from that. How do you move forward? And I think, this is something that's not always easy, but it is really important part of being successful when you're in a new cultural context. The fifth and final mistake is that I hear sometimes people talk to me about the golden rule, which is treat others as you would expect to be treated. Now, This is a great rule for life, except for when you're working in global teams or with diverse teams. Actually, it's not necessarily about treating others as you would want to be treated, but more about treating others as they would want to be treated. And this is called the platinum rule. So, this reframe is really important in helping you to recognize that it isn't just about what you think is the right thing to do, the right way to behave or interact in a situation. It's always having that eye on what does the other person, individual, or team want from you? What do they expect from you as a manager, as a leader? I think these are really important questions you can be asking yourself to reframe on that particular cultural mistake. So there we go. We have covered 5 cultural mistakes here. Before I wrap up and remind you what they are, I'm going to share with you a couple of questions for you. And then I'm going to summarize and then end with your action points from today's episodes. So, the first question I'm going to ask you is, where do you see these behavioral preferences playing out within your team? Where do you see those differences maybe causing tensions and frictions that are slowing you down? Think about that right now, those differences in behaviors and communication style. And the next question I'm going to ask you is, what are the aspects of your cultural identity that are important to you in the way that you show up at work and how you express yourself? Again, that's a really interesting cultural reflection that you can take from today's episode. So I promised that I would wrap up before giving you the actions. So just as a reminder, we talked here today about 5 cultural mistakes and reframing those. These cultural mistakes were based on the conversations that I've had in my own work over the years and the things that I see coming up most commonly. So the first mistake that I hear is we just need to make people aware of each other's cultures. The reframe was we need to go beyond awareness. It's a great starting place, but we also need to think about CQ, the 4 CQ capabilities: CQ drive, CQ knowledge, CQ strategy, and CQ action. And it starts with you. You have to see your own culture, and that's where having your behavioral preferences map is incredibly helpful. Part 2, mistake 2, is that I hear is it's all about national culture. And again, the reframe on this is national culture might be a really important playing factor in your team. But remember, national culture is only one aspect of somebody's cultural identity. There are many influences in how people show up, how they communicate, and how they interact. Mistake 3, we have a strong organizational culture and values that guide how we work. Remember, the reframe on this is yes, and cultural nuances matter, and they will be having an influence in how people are working together smartly. Mistake 4, you have to get it right culturally as a leader. The reframe on this is mistakes will happen. You don't have to know all the answers. And part of cultural intelligence is recognizing that you keep going, that you learn as you go, and you experiment to see what works. And mistake 5, the golden rule, treat others as you would expect to be treated. The reframe here is treat others as they would want to be treated. This is the platinum rule. So there you go, the 5 mistakes and their reframe. Your action from today's episode. If this episode has particularly resonated with you and you would love to know a bit more about the cultural intelligence approach, how you could apply this to yourself and your team, then there are 2 actions that I have for you. The first action is that if you would like to do more of a deep dive into cultural intelligence, I highly recommend that you get hold of the copy of my new book, Become a Global Leader. And in there is a section dedicated to cultural intelligence, where you can learn about the 10 behavioral preferences, the 4 CQ capabilities in much more detail and understand these across all of their different aspects. So that's your first action. Your second action, if you decide that actually this is a time when it would be very helpful for you and your team to understand themselves and each other in more detail, that you would like to do your own cultural intelligence profile and work out where your strengths and development areas are, then I'd love to talk to you about how I can support you with profiles, trainings, workshops, and sessions to help your team work smarter and ultimately faster as you grow globally. If you'd like to get to do that, just get in touch. Get in touch via LinkedIn. My personal details are in the show notes. And equally, you'll find a link there to the book as well, so you can buy your own copy. So thank you so much for joining me here today. I do hope you have found this episode valuable. And if you have, please feel free to share it with somebody else. Who else in your team would benefit from this? Who do you know who would also really benefit from learning more about cultural intelligence? Share this episode, and if you've greatly enjoyed it, I'd really appreciate it if you could rate and review as well. Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you next time on Cultural Communication Confidence.